Hello, class. My name is Sonia Griffin Riley, and I'm going to present to you Mezirow's Transformative Learning Theory. And I'm also going to talk about how I applied Mezirow's theory in the clinical setting. So, if you remember Mezirow's theory from a couple of weeks ago, how do we change and when we encounter learning was the question that Mezirow was seeking to answer. So, when he sought to answer this question, he used actual empirical data that he had gathered from his classroom setting. He was a professor, and he used this data to learn about students who had returned to school after they had previously been out for a period of time. So Mezirow's research was empirical. The participants were women returning to school later in life. So he came up with a 10-step process that he actually visualized within his classroom to describe the behavior that the women experienced during their encounter with a new learning activity. The 10-step process included delirium, self-examination, critical assessment, discontentment, options of new role, actions to facilitate this role, new knowledge, trying new roles, building of self-confidence, and reintegration. So Mezirow, when he developed this 10-step process, he this is what he felt like women that had been out of school for a period of time went through in order to achieve and to grow into their new role. So how I applied this theory. So in the clinical setting, I followed five students into the clinical setting, and I measured their enacting the role of becoming a nurse and how confident they were in this role. So um, uh, I'll give you a breakdown later of the five students and where they were in their learning experience. But the implementation project happened over a period of 3 weeks. And every each I picked a day, and each day I followed a different student. And this is me in China, earlier part of this year. I got the opportunity to go with TWU to China, and we got the opportunity to follow nursing students there. And so that's me in the middle with the gray shirt. So I thought I would share that with you. It was definitely an enlightening experience. So we got to see how nurses work and how they developed into their role. They definitely are more uniform when it comes to the profession than we are. And it was definitely an enlightening experience. So back to my clinical setting project. So what I was observing for, as was Mezirow in his study, I was observing each individual nursing student in the clinical setting. I was seeing how comfortable they felt in their role and how comfortable they felt in acting out nursing principles and concepts and skills. The second part of the project, I did a debriefing. After the clinical experience was over with each student, I did a debriefing with their encounter, and they didn't know that they were being observed. So it's kind of a blind evaluation. And then at the end, we had a narrative self-reflection with each other. And these are all the major tenets of Mezirow's theory. So, to give you a more clearer perception of what was the students were and where they were on their clinical experience and where they were in their area of the clinical program. So I followed five students. So my first student was a nursing student. She was novice. She was only 19. She was from UTMB Galveston. My second student was a nursing student. She was actually 45, previous life experience. She was from Prairie View A&M, but she had no previous professional experience or professional employment. My third student that I followed was age 20, and she was from the University of St. Thomas. She was on a traditional track program, and she also, too, has never had a professional job. The fourth nursing student was from UT Houston, and she was on the accelerated track. She was 19. She had done most of her prerequisites in the high school level. And she was on the accelerated track due to graduate within the next 2 semesters. My fifth student was only 16, and she was in a pre-nursing program in her high school. So as you can see, there was a variety of nursing students in different levels and different parts of entered into the profession of nursing. So I really got to get a wide synopsis of different students because no two students were quite similar, and each of them came from different schools and different areas. So I really got to see how comfortable they were in the clinical setting. So when I followed the first student, student number one from UTMB, who was on the traditional track, I noticed that she had no problem integrating roles and new tasks within her nursing role. She felt very comfortable. She had trouble with implementation of skills, but that's just probably from lack of doing it and lack of experience. She was on a traditional track, so she incorporated her role as a nurse, but she incorporated the skills on a slower pace, which would mean that she probably will get probably a more in-depth knowledge. Student two was from Prairie View A&M, and she was on an advanced role with her nursing implementation. However, with the student two, I noticed that she often thought before she did something. She had like a stop sign up all the time, and she wasn't sure. Like she had to think, was this nursing? Was this the right role? What's going on here? She often went through a process before she performed a nursing function, a nursing task, or made a nursing judgment. And my student three from the University of St. Thomas, she showed no interest in stepping into the role at the time that I observed her. Her concern was more on exams and HESIs and not failing pediatrics, which was coming up next semester, that she had heard that many people had failed. So her focus was more on just more or less passing her tests and exams at this point. So she wasn't really focused on that role development. And my student four from the University of Texas, the accelerated program, was well integrated into the nursing role. I noticed that in her role, she was more task oriented, more like completing tasks. So the critical thinking was there, but just more task oriented. And my final student, number five, the high school student, she was really engaged and she was really interested in what was going on in the clinical setting. Although she couldn't perform the nursing role, she was really engaged and she was really watching what others were doing and observing. And she was interested in how she could move into that role in the quickest route. So, as you can see, all the students were very interested. They were able to adapt to the changes very well. And overall, of the five, I would say at least four of them were moving into the nursing role just fine. So the final step was, I mean, the second step after the observation was the debriefing after the clinical experience. So the debriefing took place at the end of the day after the clinical experience, and all five students were not surprised by the feedback. They weren't aware that I was observing them and watching them in their role and how they fit and how comfortable they were. Um, but all of them took the feedback that they received as constructive feedback. They all were interested in how they could become more involved in their role and becoming and transitioning into that nurse. The only student that did not really want to talk about role development was the student who was from UT St. Thomas who was focusing on passing her HESI test. So some of the final step included our self-reflection, the narrative self-reflection, which is one of Mezirow's tenets of applying the new process and moving through the stages to get to that point where you self-reflect. So student one, self-reflection, I had them verbally express what they felt they learned that day and their reflection on how things went and what their thoughts were. So just to give you a brief overview, student one self-reflection was on need to incorporate more skills in order to be ready for her role. She was well aware that she didn't have many skills yet, but she did have a good foundation. Student two, her self-reflection was on taking on new roles after graduation. So she was more concerned about how she would take on the responsibility of a RN in the full capacity. Student three, self-reflection, was passing without repeating, and she was more focused on time management. As we've discussed in the past, she was more worried about HESIs and different tests that she had to pass. Student four, self-reflection, was on job placement after graduation and competing with other graduating schools of nursing. And my final student self-reflection was on clear guidance to enter into the profession, and she wanted to know the fastest route to complete her goal. So after the self-reflection process and following the five students, which five students is not very many to get a good feeling or synopsis of how Mezirow's theory can really apply and affect nursing students and those who want to be nurses. I did get a clear perspective about what I feel and how I feel about Mezirow's transformative learning theory. So the conclusion that I came to was that Mezirow's theory of transformative learning proved to be true in this small sample of the five students. Only one, the older student, age 45, showed transition through steps 1 through 4 of his 10-step process. The other four students seemed to begin with step 5 and move forward. So it was my conclusion that Mezirow's theory still applies to students who have been out of school for a period of time and returning to school later in life. So I came to several self-conclusions based on what I saw in the clinical setting. The first conclusion that I came to was that I would not personally marry this theory of Mezirow's transformative learning. And my thoughts are that I would focus more on the reflection aspect, which is the final aspect, in getting a deeper understanding of how I can focus on teaching students to have meaningful self-reflection and how to verbalize their self-reflection with others in order to achieve their goals. So, in in essence, I like Mezirow's theory, but I don't think it applies to every student. But you're welcome to. My next slide has many references on it, and you're welcome to review his theory if you like it and apply it and marry it. But as for now, I believe that I'm with the literature on the conclusion that his theory is not applicable to everyone. Not all go through that delirium phase, that period of confusion. And I believe that some people jump right in and they take on the new role with no problems. So there's the references if you want to review more on his reflection theory and also more on his application to learn about how to apply his 10-step process. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you on the discussion board. Thank you.